Hello again. Let's tell you about a disturbing report from News 24 tonight that the return of 17 South Africans who are stranded somewhere in the area where there's the Russia-Ukraine war is being delayed due to the financial demands from military contractors who helped to get them there. The contractors are reportedly seeking refunds for monies that was spent, and they want these refunds apparently to come from the Mkhonto party and some of the family members. Let's take this further with Ricardo Teixeira, a defence and national security analyst. Good to have you on the SABC as always, especially on this issue over the last few weeks. So the issue, Ricardo, of refunds that these military contractors were told are now demanding, what are the chances that that will actually happen, especially when you consider the financial state of some of the families of these men and the fact that the MKP has basically said it has no responsibility, no involvement in the saga?
Thank you very much for having me. I think it's indicative of the state of the Russian military that they are seeming to ask for the funds back. I think it shows that they are also maybe starting to run out of funding themselves. But it is clear that money did change hands here, and they seem to want their money back. And I think for anyone that thinks that Russia is some sort of icon, take a look at the corruption in their system, and it'll make the corruption in our system look like we're well behaved. But it's clear that money has changed hands and they seem to want that money back. And the insistence that MK give that money back, I think leans some credence towards the allegations that MK was given funding and some sort of money in exchange for the personnel that was sent over.
It begs the question of why military contractors would want a refund in the first place and what they ultimately were promised, right, about the role of these 17 men in whatever function they were meant to perform, especially in the Donbas region, which is where we were initially told they were stuck.
From what I know of the Russian military, this is just indicative as well of the extortion and the corruption within the system. There is a long and detailed record and history of corruption within the Russian military. You see it as well if you look at how the Russian military executed its war in Ukraine. In the beginning, what Putin thought his military was versus what it turned out being was something that was hollowed out by corruption, and that corruption is endemic throughout the institution. And I do think that part of this as well is just some people on the Russian side trying to extort some additional funding or just what they can get out of it, but also in an attempt to buy some time on their side. I don't think that there is much time to buy, but I think that it's just purely the Russians being the Russians.
But can the Russian government, let's say, because that's ultimately who the military answers to, could the Kremlin or the Russian government simply order the release of these 17 South Africans?
Yes, 100%. They could. They could say right now, bring them back from the front line and send them back to South Africa. But they won't. And I want to stress again, as I've stressed in our previous engagements, Russia is not our friend. And this is clear in this whole engagement. They could very easily bring them back and then pull them away from the front lines and send them back. But they won't, because that's not what Russia does.
Is that because ultimately these men are the responsibility of the contractors, who I'd imagine would be some sort of private entity in a way that then supplies military labor? Is that where the responsibility or the custody for these people would fall?
Again, knowing what I do about the Russian military, I don't think they would take any sort of responsibility. I think they view the South Africans that have gone over the way, they view any other conscript or anyone that's taken a contract and been sent to the front as just another batch of meat. It's, they call them meat waves for a reason. They have no respect for human life, and they have callously sent hundreds of thousands of men to the front, over 1.2 million casualties on the Russian side at this point. And again, they're not going to take responsibility for this. And they could very easily send them back, but they won't, because that's just not how Russia does things. And the way they are treating them is very in character for how the Russian military views people and its labor.
Back to the report then that was published by News 24. In fact, they've published quite a few since you and I last spoke. They also said that there are conversations going on between the South African government and Russia, but they're not going to go into detail, it would appear at this stage, on what those discussions entail, at least not officially or to the public. would there be an expectation for the South African government to give anything in return for these men being allowed to come home?
In my opinion, they shouldn't be. The government had nothing. Our government, at least, had nothing to do with this. This was done in what appears to be a move by the MK party, and again, there are allegations that they received funding. But there shouldn't be any sort of onus on the South African government to give them any money. I mean, there's the famous line of, governments shouldn't negotiate with terrorists. Unfortunately, that's exactly what we have to do now. But again, I don't think the South African government is in any way responsible for giving them any sort of funding. I think they are trying their best to bring those gentlemen home, and I hope they do. Having seen some of their remarks in the reporting from News 24, their morale is at the rock bottom. I think they are experiencing literal hell on earth. I'm amazed that they are all still alive and still kicking,
Right.
because the life expectancy on the front is not very good, not very high. But I hope they get to bring them back.
Just on that, on the issue of you saying you're surprised that these men are still alive, do we know that for a fact, that all 17 are ultimately still alive? And on that note, would it serve their recruiters, especially those who are accused of involvement here in South Africa, better if these men never came back? Because ultimately, if they do return, they would have to, or they would at least be in a position, right, to testify in court and help put these guys behind bars.
So the News 24 report says that they, from an impeccable source, according to the article, that they are still alive. And that, to be honest, I'm quite surprised, because the situation on the front is quite dire. Russia loses anywhere between 800 and 1,000 men a day. That's dead and wounded combined. So it's really, this is one of the most deadliest battlefields in human history. The fact that they are still alive does surprise me, and I hope that they do all still make it home alive. If they were not to come home alive, there could be an argument to be made that they had been sold into trafficking, and that those that sent them on their way from the MK party would then be liable for their deaths and could be charged with murder. But again, this is a very complicated and intricate legal question, and I'm not a legal scholar, but I would hope that if they could bring them all back home alive, that they can then be witnesses and then be give testimony in any sort of legal trial against those that sent them over.
All right, Ricardo, thank you so much for speaking to us as always. Ricardo Teixeira, Defence and National Security Analyst, joining us here on The Full View on SABC News.